I was working on an actual review of Pikmin 4, but I don't think I've ever got so many requests to do a specific video. So f it, you guys asked for it, so here we are. After 10 long years, Pikmin 4 is finally here, and to no one's surprise, it's fantastic. We're looking at a whopping 9 Pikmin types in a single entry, so we're going to be adding those onto the list I made last time. As for that list, I wanted to make some small adjustments. First of all, bumping 3's pinks to S. After I did the list, I did another 100% Pikmin 3 run and definitely took notice on how you can use them to get basically every single fruit in that game. And considering how weak enemies in 3 are, their 0.5x damage multiplier is hardly a setback. Get a mob of pinks, ignite a spicy spray, and you're practically unstoppable. I mean really, they're good in almost every scenario. Also moving 3's yellows down. They're still good, definitely belong in B. Most useful in missions and especially bingo for their better throwing, but are dropped hard in the story once you get pinks. I also wanted to bump 1's iteration of reds up. Pikmin 1's fire is the second most dangerous elemental hazard in the series besides 2's electricity, since fire kills in a second and a half compared to the 5 or 6 seconds it takes in 2, 3, or 4. Enemies in the first game are tough, and outside bombs, you don't have any tools like spicy potions or shop items to take care of dudes, so being the strongest given those circumstances is substantial. Also, when I arrange it like that, it looks like white and red are about to give a high five.
Give me some sugar, bro!
Before jumping in, I got a lot of comments on some things I feel should be addressed. Firstly, why weren't mushroom Pikmin, or Puffmin as some call them, on the list? Multiple reasons, but a big one is that without glitches, they are not a controllable Pikmin. They're more comparable to an enemy, in fact. To quickly catch anyone out of the loop up to speed, in Pikmin 1, the enemy Puffstool has an attack where it will shoot out spores that will essentially turn Pikmin into zombies. When Pikmin become little zombie mushrooms, they will follow Puffstool around and attack Olimar if in range. They will actually keep their original traits, so a mushroom Pikmin that was originally a blue can still safely enter water. So if anything, being mushroomified is more of a state your Pikmin can be in than it is a unique unit, which at that point, I might as well add stunned or burning Pikmin as their own entries as well. Even if we do want to count them as their own unit, it always seemed pointless to include them on these sort of lists anyway, because unless you're trying to be funny or are petty about another type, it's not like these guys are going to be placed anywhere but the bottom of the list on their own separate tier. Lastly, why are yellows from 2 so high? Apologies if I wasn't clear enough, but here's why. Electricity in 2 is ridiculous. It's the most dangerous thing in that game alongside bombs, and anode beetles alone are in over half of the caves. In a game as ruthless as 2, having immunity to something as dangerous as electricity is a big deal. Also, I won't be spoiling what the final boss is or anything, but to fully analyze the types, I will be mentioning what elemental hazards it and other bosses or enemies use, what levels best utilize which types, so if you don't want to hear any of that, you've been warned. Enough of the pleasantries. Let's take a look at our first type, reds. As per usual, reds are resistant to fire, and more notably retain their 1.5x damage multiplier, which makes them ideal for most combat situations. Their high attack power is what usually carries them in each game, and it does in 4 as well, I'd argue. But fire itself is a fairly common hazard this time around. Multiple enemies use it, including the final boss. Many caves have lava floors, and fire geysers specifically have a much larger radius than we've ever seen in past centuries. I learned that one the hard way.
I saw a mod for Pikmin 3 that it was...
Shoot-to-4 are these fire starters only reds can carry that are used to burn down hay walls. It can even be used to tear down ice walls and remove ice off enemies, even a boss. In fact, this is one of the very few things Ochi cannot do, which we might as well talk about now. I won't be ranking Ochi on here since in terms of functionality, he's more similar to a player character than a Pikmin. In fact, IMO, he really should have been the 2-player option opposed to whatever the hell this is. But if I was ranking him, he'd be triple S. He's super fun to use, but he's broken. If the game will let you, you could honestly clear most caves with just Ochi, and doing so wouldn't even be difficult. That's how good he is. This bastard can resist fire, ice, electricity, poison. He can swim, fight, and carry stuff underwater. He can attack flying enemies, stun dudes with his charge, and even count as 100 Pikmin when carrying an object. Mind you, that's just a handful of his abilities. Again, he's super fun to use, but he's absolutely busted. And as you could probably gather from the couple of things I listed, he invalidates most Pikmin in 4. To my knowledge, there are only 2 potential type-specific roadblocks Ochi cannot interact with: fire starters and crystal gates, making reds and rocks the only 2 types that cannot be predominantly replaced by Ochi. Given how much of the meta in 4 revolves around Ochi, not being replaceable is an attractive perk to have. I'm giving them a high B. Yellows are one of the few types I had a hard time ranking. On paper, they sound better than Pikmin 3's yellows. They of course can be thrown higher, dig faster, and are resistant to electricity. So basically all the perks they had in 3, except electricity can kill this time around. ground. It's nowhere near the level of danger presented in 2, but killing at all still makes it dangerous, unlike 3 where it would just stun Pikmin. So what gives them? Well, there's multiple factors that diminish the value of yellows this time around. Firstly, while their verticality seems to be needed for more treasures than ever before, Ochi can knock almost anything on a high ledge down with a simple charge. Caves will occasionally have treasure hanging from the ceiling via a spider web, but I believe in every single instance of that, there is always a ledge or platform nearby allowing you to throw any type. I'm coming off my 3rd playthrough of the game. Yes, I've already beaten the game 3 times. And I can only think of a handful of situations where you absolutely need yellows to grab something, as there is no way for Ochi to knock it down, usually because it is partially buried. However, even in those scenarios, you could feasibly use pinks instead. The best counter argument in that regard would be that you don't get pinks until much later, and yellows let you multitask away from Ochi, so there is that to consider. But then there's the matter of controls. In Pikmin 3, because of the pointer controls, yellows were very good. You could not only throw them super high, but also super far. Pair that with the fact that, thanks to the controls, you could always aim independently of your movement, and suddenly extended throw length becomes a pretty big deal. Force controls are a bit more stiff, being harder to aim independently from your movement, and with 4's auto lock on, basically any Pikmin can now be thrown far given you're targeting something. So yellows are back to how they were in 1 and 2, where better throwing mostly means greater height, not distance, which would still be good, was it not for the fact that flying and elevated enemies, you know, your blowhogs and your spider bosses, are easier to target than ever before. In Pikmins 1 through 3, there was a noticeable difference when fighting an elevated boss of yellows versus with any other Pikmin type, and 4 that is rarely the case, at least not to the same degree. The single enemy in 4 where a yellow's throw height makes a substantial difference is the Baldy Longlegs, which only appears in the final area of the game. The final area that, since it recommends you have pinks, you're more than likely going to be taking it down with them instead. That's not to say yellows don't make fighting certain enemies easier. They still do. It's just the new auto lock on that will seemingly increase a Pikmin's throw distance when targeting makes that difference less stark than it was in previous entries. In fact, Pikmin 4's auto lock on does so much heavy lifting that, unlike 3, the inclusion of a lock on button almost seems trivial. As for electricity, sure, it's more dangerous than in 3, but there aren't a lot of electric enemies in 4, which is funny to say because in terms of quantity of enemies, 4 has the largest number of enemies that use electricity, but in terms of how frequently said enemies are actually used, it's pretty scarce. You know how at the start of the video I was saying how more than half the caves in 2 had anode beetles? Well, guess how many caves in 4 have them? One cave. And they aren't even that dangerous in 4. I was ready to put them in C, but there's one last thing that defines yellows in 4. Their digging speed. In 3, their speed was tied with rock Pikmin, a solid 2x. But in 4, not only are they the only Pikmin with a different dig speed, their dig speed isn't 1.5x like Reds from 2 and 3. It isn't 2x like Rocks and Yellows from 3. In Pikmin 4, a Yellow's digging speed is 4 times faster than any other Pikmin. That is insane. These guys are digging legends in this game. Raid Shadow Legend, and there's a lot more stuff to dig up in 4. Probably the most we've seen in any game up to this point, despite being a bit more niche this time around, and while the difference isn't as drastic, they do still make fighting certain enemies easier, are insane diggers, and are utilized a lot more early game than you'd expect. Not amazing, but I think it's enough to keep them out of C. Alright, I've been asked for my opinion on this one specifically several times since the game dropped, the blues. Ever since my last 2 Pikmin videos, I've been recognized as, quote, the guy who hates blues. And I want to make something clear. The guy I really am is the guy who said, Nintendo, please for the love of God, please buff these boys. I want to use them. I mean, I even got an idea for you that you can steal. I don't care, just make them good. I don't hate them. Plus, have you seen Nintendo's marketing? They're constantly putting blues in English. If anything, Nintendo is the one handing them the short end of the stick. For the sake of time, I'm going to assume you've already heard my argument on why I don't believe blues are particularly good. But if you haven't and you want a condensed version, just click on my first tier list video and then go to the small key argument segment. With that out of the way, what did they do to buff blues since 3? Absolutely nothing. And I truly mean nothing, since they still can't save drowning Pikmin as they could in 1 and 2. Not that it would have been too helpful, since much like 3, drowning Pikmin will save themselves. If anything, water is less of a concern than ever before, since Pikmin will now automatically disengage if you run in, which you would think would make blues even worse than they were in 3. Because in 4, not only can you have any Pikmin travel over water if you freeze it, but we have Ochi now, and not only can he carry your entire squad over water, there isn't a single thing blues can do that Ochi cannot do. In fact, after his chomp and carry upgrades, Ochi is more efficient underwater than blues are. And sure, they are upgrades, but you can easily get every single water-based upgrade before you even step foot in the level of the most water. There is no attribute unique to blues that make them nice to have even when you don't need them. And because of Ochi, you don't need them, unless you want to count their resistance to water attacks as a unique attribute. But being resistant to a barely dangerous hazard is not a unique facet of blues. They even added sprinklers to give blues a little more worth. Yeah, can't freeze or fly over that with your winged or ice Pikmin, but beyond the fact that you can get any type past a sprinkler with very little struggle, there are very few of them, all of them can be turned off, and much like how Ochi can go underwater and do anything a blue can do, Ochi can also go in the sprinkler water no problem after an upgrade. Mind you, it's not even an upgrade you need to buy, it's something you're just handed as early as day 3. The same free upgrade that allows Ochi to swim in water, by the way. Also, I just want to interject and give myself some credit for how much time I put into this game to do research for this list. Pikmin 4 doesn't have a day select like 3 does, so I've had to sit through that long as hell intro anytime I needed to test something like, say, how Ochi behaves with or without certain upgrades, since you can't undo an Ochi upgrade. Anyways, again, Ochi invalidates most Pikmin, but the strength of blues has never been their combat power or scavenging. It's been their utility, and if another unit, in this case Ochi, can replace that utility, that's rough to say the least. Because let's just say Ochi can do everything a red Pikmin can do. As we established earlier, that is not the case, but for the sake of arguments, let's pretend he can. Well, in that scenario, even though you don't need reds, they still got that 1.5x damage multiplier going for them, which is pretty substantial in a game where combat is a significant focus. Sure, Ochi is strong, but even though he can be the equivalent of 100 Pikmin when carrying, he's far from the equivalent of 100 Pikmin when fighting. And even as little as 20 Pikmin of a damage buff makes a significant difference. But if the reason you use blues is to do the handful of things that require you to go in water, and Ochi can do all those things, then what's the point of blues? Well, in the case of 4, multitasking, believe it or not. Yeah, even though blues have not been buffed, you use them a lot more than 3 and even 2. So they're in a similar situation as they were in Pikmin 1, where their value is less about them being good and more about the level designs themselves, including a decent amount of things that need to be done underwater. Well, that is until the end of the game at least. Yeah, their usefulness basically peaks at serene shores. Then as the game progresses, there are less and less instances where you'll want to pull out blues. In fact, in the very next level, there isn't a single point where you'd ever want to use them. The one and only body of water in that entire level can be easily drained with a simple button press right next to said body of water. The game gets especially desperate in the final cave. It recommends you enter with them, and blue candy pop buds outnumber every other colored candy pop bud in that cave by a significant margin. In fact, I think I counted a whopping 10 of them in that cave alone. As if the game is making one final attempt to be like, please use blues. My advice, don't make blues. Just take an ice Pikmin. A big part of that is because the final boss has 0 water-based attacks. And also, it's pointless because Ochi can swim by this point. Again, you do not have to buy that upgrade. Even despite that, water is such a non-issue in this cave. There was one floor in the cave that had a spider over water, and I was like, aw, shit, they really got me by the balls now. Then I was like, wait a second, I have ice Pikmin. Can you believe I almost made blues for that? Even still, I still stand by my claim that they are more useful in 4 than they were in 2 and 3. And they've been indirectly buffed since pinks have been nerfed. How? Well, let's put these boys in a high C, and let's talk about it. Pinks, aka winged Pikmin, the gods of Pikmin 3, have been nerfed in seemingly every way possible. They hardcore invalidated blues in 3, but in 4, they have a really hard time grabbing stuff out of the water. A lot of times, they just straight up can't. Even worse than that is that they can no longer be charged while you're in water. That's a huge deal because that means you can't use them at all when submerged. Another nerf just comes in terms of how Pikmin 4 is fundamentally designed. Given Pikmin 3 had a larger focus on multitasking considering the 3 captains and all, and the fact that you could steamroll like 90% of every map of just pinks alone, yeah, they were pretty dang good in 3, in ways that just aren't comparable in 4. There are more type-specific roadblocks in 4, meaning pinks are unable to take over as much as they could previously. Plus, since you have to buy the go here function, there are essentially 2 captains this time around, and one of them, your player character, cannot jump. Multitasking sincerely is less of a focus, which is notable when pinks are most defined by their scavenging. Even if 4 was designed like 3, a winged Pikmin's pathing is brain dead in 4. That's not to say they won't ever take shortcuts now. They still can, but it's a lot less elegant than it once was in 3. I would say given the changes, the strongest facet of pinks now is that they are your safest option to carry back items. They'll still fly over hazards and enemies, and are usually the best option to farm spicy berries given how fast and safely they can fly to and from a spider wart. Safe scavenging is a perk most notable in the last area where there are poison mushrooms and mud swamps everywhere. They still have their half damage nerf, which is a bigger concern here given the enemies in 4 are generally more challenging than they were in 3. Even still, being able to charge pinks at flying or elevated enemies is still very advantageous against specific enemies. Another nerf is that pinks can be squashed now. I'm not sure why they couldn't in 3, but it is a mark against them here. Their only buff is their digging. It was 0.5x in 3, but is now the default digging speed. As mentioned earlier though, yellows are the only Pikmin with a different digging speed in 4. Be that as it may, that is an area they are no longer handicapped in comparison to most other Pikmin. While the mighty have fallen, flying, just inherently I'd argue, is such a valuable trait to have that it still gives winged Pikmin a lot of versatility. A definite downgrade overall, but still good enough to be a high C. From a definite downgrade to a definite upgrade, purples. In Pikmin 3, purples were hardcore nerfed. Some people will even tell you that they are the worst Pikmin in that game. Don't get me wrong, they were bad, but I still think 3's whites were worse since no thanks to the absence of poison, alongside their damage, their speed, and their digging nerf. Whites in 3 were essentially flightless pinks. The ultimate testament of their worthlessness in 3 is the mission Thirsty Desert Remix, where there are very few things in that map they can carry back faster than pinks. In Pikmin 3, whites were basically just gold pile slaves. Purples at least still counted as 10 Pikmin on objects, which was crucial to certain mission stages, and had the highest standard attack strength and second fastest digging speed. All that aside, they still definitely needed an upgrade, and 4 thankfully gives them that upgrade. As per usual, they still count as 10 Pikmin when carrying an object, and have higher than average attack strength. In this case, still tied with reds much like in 3. However, returning from 2 is their ability to instantly weigh down flying enemies with just a single purple, and resistance to being blown around via a puffy blowhog, which actually extends to the resistance to being sucked up by jelly floats, bog swallows, and waddle quaves. They no longer stun enemies like they did in 2, which I mean, understandable given how insane that stun was, but they do inflict a good deal of damage upon connecting with an enemy, which looks really bizarre. There's no animation or anything. They just miraculously deal a bunch of damage the second they hug a dude. Deadly hug though, and I'd argue it's their defining trait this time around. They have a shorter throw arc than other Pikmin types, but given your enemy is in range, they are by far the best Pikmin to throw. High A. They don't break or define the meta, but they are very good. But being good when thrown was a rock Pikmin's whole thing, right? So is there overlap of rocks and purples? Well, there would have been, was it not for the fact that the fundamentals of rock boys are not the same as they were in 3. Rock Pikmin can break crystal walls, something Ochi cannot do. They have different damage properties in combat, and are impervious to stab and crush attacks. Mostly. Back to that one in a bit. In Pikmin 3, rocks were terrible when charged since they only dealt 10 damage, equivalent to a standard attack, then rolled way the hell back. But they were great throwing weapons, inflicting tons of damage on impact. Those traits have been seemingly swapped in 4. I mean, their throwing is still good. From my own testing, which by the way, Pikmin 4's ability to interact with enemies as part of the Picklopedia came in so clutch for the making of this video. The amount of damage inflicted via a throw seemed to change depending on the size of the enemy. For water dumples, a throw seemed to do 66 damage, a third of their health, whereas in most other enemies, such as a Wollihop, it was 40. But for charging, 40 is always the amount of damage dealt, making charging the ideal way to handle rock boys in combat now since they all hit simultaneously. Because even with 4's incredibly fast throw speed, it still takes time to throw, say, 25 Pikmin, whereas charging 25 Pikmin, that's instantaneous. Much like in 3, they cannot latch onto enemies, making them not the best choice for anything you can't charge. Although they can latch onto suspended treasures now. That, paired with marginally smarter AI, makes them better scavengers than they were in 3. As alluded to, their resistance to stab attacks, such as an attack from a Joustmite, returns. However, their resistance to crush attacks is, complicated. In Pikmin 3, there were 0 qualifiers to their crush resistance. It was 100% resistance 100% of the time. But rock Pikmin can die to crush damage in 4 given the circumstance that they are standing on a hard surface. The standout example of this would have to be the Test Tubs Dandori challenge. Most of the map is ceramic since you're in something of a bathroom environment, so don't leave your rocks to take care of this Wollihop on their own because they will likely die. That's a fairly niche exception, however, as most environments will have you traversing more organic terrain where rock Pikmin will be resistant. Super helpful when faced up against your Canalarvas and beetles. Some final minor points. They cannot break these ceramic pots for some reason, and unlike 3. There are no crystallized enemies that require the use of rocks. Overall, I think 3's iteration of rock Pikmin have the slight edge, mostly since they were new to that game, so much of 3's design was built around them. Nonetheless, they are still great in combat, and especially given their resistances, do not have as much overlap with purples as you would think. A tier. With purples once more being good, and rocks still being viable even with said purple buffs, I had high hopes that whites would likewise see some substantial buffs. And well, there is poison now, so they got that going for them. Unfortunately, they still have many of the downsides they had in 3. Starting out with the positives, however, white Pikmin have the fastest movement speed, are once again resistant to poison, and will damage enemies when ingested. Unlike Pikmin 3, where your standard Bulborb needed to eat a whopping 5 whites to die, their poison damage has been restored to its former glory, where Bulborb only needs to eat a single white to die. All of that sounds great, but also returning from 3 is their half damage output. Dealing a mere 0.5x damage is a huge setback, and if you're going to have that setback, you need something huge to counteract it, such as flying or straight up freezing enemies. White Pikmin do not have that compensation, unless you want to count their poison, but poisoning an enemy should be little more than a silver lining to losing a Pikmin. You shouldn't want it to happen, especially since the enemies in 4 that do kill Pikmin via consumption are easy to take down without any losses regardless. I really don't understand the decision to have their damage in Pikmin 3 and by extension Pikmin 4. Having Pink's damage output, for example, makes sense because being the only Pikmin that can charge something off the ground makes them great at fighting said enemies even with that handicap. There are a handful of enemies in 3 and 4 in which you could argue that Pinks are the optimal choice to fight with. What enemies in Pikmin 4 are whites the optimal pick to fight with? The moldy Slooch? Well, in that scenario, they're only the best because unless you want to self-inflict poison upon your Pikmin, they are the only Pikmin you can fight with. To me, that's like saying blues are the best choice to fight enemies underwater. Like, no duh, right? They're the only Pikmin in which you can fight things underwater. So if an enemy's main habitat is water, I mean, it's like, what's 1 + 1? And most importantly, there's a little doggy you need to take into consideration. If you didn't have an Ochi that can easily deal with poison all on his own, or if poison was an exceedingly common hazard, those would be strong arguments in the white Pikmin's favor, but on the contrary, poison is an exceedingly rare hazard for the majority of the game. It isn't until the final area of the game you finally get a bunch of poison enemies and mushrooms to deal with. But by the time you get to that final level, Ochi scarfed down so many Ochiroids that he's quite the force to be reckoned with. So you add up the fact that all poison enemies are notably weak considering they were designed to be fought with the weakest Pikmin in mind, with the fact that Ochi can one-shot most small enemies by this point in the game, and what you're left with is a type that can, unfortunately, be very easily ignored. I mean, sincerely, I didn't even notice what was happening until I reviewed all my footage. But even when I had white Pikmin with me, they are so weak that if I saw a poison enemy, I would often just have Ochi take care of it because I didn't want to lose any Pikmin. This is also a scenario where Pikmin 4's 3-type limitation really works against whites, because I might maybe want 10 whites just to take care of poison mushrooms faster. But if I have whites out at all, that's taking the place of another much better Pikmin I could have out instead. And I don't need that many whites out to take care of mushrooms. So because of that restriction, I just say f it entirely. Ochi is more than capable enough to handle a couple of brief situations I'd want them. So if poison resistance isn't a good enough selling point, and damaging enemies that eat Pikmin isn't either, because what are we saying at that point? The best thing about white Pikmin is when they die? Then the value of white Pikmin has got to all rely on their speed. And yeah, they do have the fastest movement speed, so therefore they're the best to carry back objects, right? But this is no longer Pikmin 2, where whites were the uncontested champs at carrying stuff back just because all the other types almost always took the same routing. In Pikmin 3 and 4, there's a lot more than just raw speed to consider. Pathing is a lot more complex and is therefore the other half of the equation here. Blues can take shortcuts through water, and pinks will not only as well take said shortcuts, but can also take elevation shortcuts. That's of course on top of the fact that since they'll be airborne, they're often your safest option to carry back items. All this to say, a white Pikmin's speed needs to be fast enough to make up for the fact they cannot take water or elevation shortcuts. Regrettably, it often is not. And don't get me wrong, it's not nearly as bad as it was in 3, although that's less about whites being better and more about pinks being so dumb now that whites and pinks are a lot more comparable in this aspect than they really should be. I mean, what the fuck? Why are you taking the rope? You can fly! It seems to depend on the level, but in areas where pinks do have unique pathing, whites cannot keep up as their speed isn't nearly fast enough. In much the same way how whites were gold pile slaves in 3, a white Pikmin's speed difference is most notable when carrying objects from stacks or groups. But a lot of times, it isn't enough to make up for the slightest shortcut a blue or pink can take. The Dandori mission Oasis of Order is where this is the most apparent. When returning these raw materials, winged Pikmin can fly over this little puddle, whereas whereas white Pikmin have to take the slightest detour to the left here, and even that small detour is enough to make them a slower option to carry these back. Additionally, despite berry treasure making a return, white Pikmin are no longer required to unearth them and will not automatically detect them and start digging things up when above them. However, they are not terrible diggers like they were in 3 anymore, although that's only because, again, besides yellows, all Pikmin in 4 share the same dig speed. What even about yellows makes them such good diggers anyway? I mean, I don't mind, as giving yellows a little extra perk gives them some added versatility, but why aren't the white Pikmin the fast diggers? I mean, it would make sense considering not only was digging up buried treasure one of their main things in 2, but they're already the fast ones, so come on Nintendo, throw these guys a bone, in which they can quickly unearth from the ground. It really pains me to do this, but I unfortunately think they're a low C. Between Ochi being able to quickly and efficiently replace their poison duties, their halved damage output, and their speed not being fast enough to make up for minor shortcuts, white Pikmin once again have been done dirty. The way I see it, there are 4 very easy ways to buff white Pikmin. A. Give them standard attack strength. I honestly don't understand why it's 0.5x, since it's not like they'd be busted otherwise. B. Make them stupid fast. So fast, their speed can make up for even the slightest detour. C. Make poison as a hazard more dangerous. As is, you have just as long to whistle your Pikmin as any other hazard. And finally, D. Just make them the best diggers alongside yellows. Do all 4 of those and they might be S tier, but realistically, 1 or 2 of those buffs would be enough to at least bump them up to B. Alright, it's time for the 2 new faces, starting with Ice Pikmin. New Pikmin seem to constantly be defining the meta of their respective introduction. Purples were the meta of 2, pinks were the meta of 3, and now with 4, Ice Pikmin, and just ice in general, plays a huge part of the game. As alluded to many times, Ice Pikmin can freeze pools of water, allowing any Pikmin to travel on top. This will likewise freeze any enemies, and as shown earlier, even bosses that happen to be touching said water. Permanently freeze, mind you, until you whistle your ice boys back out of the water. Needless to say, since they need to be in the water to freeze it, that also means they can float over water, as you may expect. Despite all of that, they are not resistant to water. They are still susceptible to the very uncommon and the not very unsafe water hazards. Regardless, do keep that in mind. Ice Pikmin are both incapable of being frozen, an elemental hazard new to 4, and catching frostbite, which is a new hazard of sorts. Basically, certain caves are freezing cold, and any Pikmin not on Ochi for an extended period of time will stop everything they're doing and start shivering until whistled. That is, all Pikmin but Ice Boys. A bit rare, but in the last area's caves, they introduce mud, which neither you, blue Pikmin, or even Ochi can safely enter. You know what Pikmin can safely enter mud? In fact, they can freeze mud, which is super helpful and needed at points. The only 2 circumstances I know of in which they'll struggle in mud is if they enter it while in a panic state, or if they are shot with mud while already floating in it. Outside those 2 rare scenarios, they are completely safe in mud. Then lastly, and most notably, they can freeze enemies. Like any enemy. All bosses, anything. When an enemy is frozen, obviously they can't move or do anything to kill Pikmin when in said immobilized state. But to sweeten the deal, any impenetrable parts of said enemy become vulnerable. A burrowing Snagrit's snake-like body is normally completely immune to the horde of helpless Pikmin below, but freeze that thing with just a handful of ice cubes, and every Pikmin whacking at it is suddenly dealing damage. Freezing an enemy in 4 is the equivalent of using Bitter Spray in Pikmin 2, except instead of being this rare resource you have to grind for, it's just something you can basically do whenever you want. You don't even need that many ice Pikmin to do it. Seriously, ignite a spicy potion, which really shouldn't be a problem since Pikmin 4 hands that shit out like candy, and as little as 10 ice Pikmin can quickly freeze the majority of bosses in the game. For non-bosses, same principle minus the spicy. Your standard big Bulborb, for instance, 10 ice boys and you'll freeze it before it can even shake anything off. On top of all of that, ice Pikmin are much like white Pikmin in that having them ingested by enemies has a silver lining. In this case, well, obviously freezing that enemy. The single downside of ice Pikmin is that they only deal half damage, but their freeze ability is just so good, especially when paired with reds, rocks, purples, or god forbid Ochi's charge, that friends of mine didn't even realize that was the case. Oh, by the way, anything you freeze while in the air will instantly shatter once it hits the ground. Easy S. Last but certainly not least are the glow Pikmin. Glowies, as everyone's been calling them, are similar to Bulbmin in that they are units impervious to all elemental damage, but they have the drawback of not being available to use in the overworld. You can only use them in caves and in the night expeditions new to 4, which by the way, should have totally had an endless mode of co-op. The night stuff is a super fun innovation, and an endless mode could have added so much replay value to 4. Glow Pikmin are also similar to Bulbmin in that they can replenish your numbers in caves if you ever happen to lose some Pikmin. However, unlike Bulbmin, which rarely appear in caves, you can spawn glowies basically whenever you want. There's a lot of ways to cheese things in 4, but this might be the biggest one because even without rewinds, it almost guarantees you will always have max Pikmin, given if you're anything like me, you're going to have upwards of 200 of these things stockpiled by the end of the game. Since glow boys float, that of course makes them able to travel over mud. However, despite what the lying ass wiki says, they are not resistant to mud attacks, which also means they likewise are not burial resistant as seen by their interactions with both the Mucker Skates and Mamutas. Pikmin wiki, I still love you. One of the best traits of glow Pikmin is that they will never idle for an extended period of time. Even if you dismiss them, they will teleport right back to you. This means you could put them on a task like carry something back, and as soon as they finish, they just teleport right back to you. And finally, in one of their coolest traits, if you hold a charge of glow Pikmin, they will all merge into this weird ass glow ball, and when you release, you can shoot that ball out at an enemy, stunning said enemy before overpowering it with all the glowies you had in that ball. Super cool. Glow Pikmin are unquestionable S. High S in fact. The question I had to answer was, are they better than purples from 2? And as insanely good as glow Pikmin are, they do not define the playing experience of Pikmin 4 in the same way that purples define the playing experience of Pikmin 2. So I think they're just barely behind 2's purples. If you could use them out in the overworld during the day, I definitely think it'd be a different story. They are still an awesome inclusion and definitely the best type in 4. But the second purples could stunlock anything, I mean, it was over. Nonetheless, just the fact I had to ask myself if glowies were better than them at all just goes to show how insane glow Pikmin are in 4. But there we go. There we have not only every Pikmin in Pikmin 4, but we now have a fully complete tier list. A lot of testing and deliberation went into this list, for all 4 games really, but for me at least, I think this is it. Needless to say, and as always of course, despite the heavy research I put into this topic, this list is still mostly only based on my own subjective opinion. I would love to hear what you guys think down below, and if you'd like to make a tier list yourself, I made a tier maker using the assets made for this video. There will be a pinned comment below. Thanks for hearing me out, and until the next Pikmin 4 related vid, I'll catch you later. See ya! Hey, thanks for watching this video that took like 10 years to make. I'd like to give a special thanks to patrons such as Wimbling, Verzi Edits, Some Crazy Idiot, Rolling Batter, Victoria Mars, Kenzel Tien, Ian, GamePlayer1500, Evan Halbert, Drew Kellenberger, David Pacheco, David Marchesi, Amanda Guth, and Albion. And until next time, have a good one.